Okay, so good morning, everyone. We're really excited you could join us today for this virtual event, From Parchment to Pixel, Conservation and Digitization of Illuminated Manuscripts. My name is Jackie Becky, and I'm a reference librarian at the Huntington. This event is part of an ongoing series, a library webinar series presented by the Reader Services Department. I should mention that this presentation is being recorded, and all attendees will receive an email with links to access this recorded presentation along with a companion research guide after the event has concluded. Today we'll be discussing an illuminated manuscript created in 1567 by William Bowyer, keeper of the records in the Tower of London, for Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester. Our program follows a single manuscript as it travels from curator to conservator to digitization team, who all work together to transform a 16th century manuscript into a 21st century digital tool. Today I'm joined by three fabulous panelists. Dr. Vanessa Wilkie curates the library's renowned collections of medieval manuscripts in British history. She earned her PhD in British history from the University of California at Riverside and was visiting assistant professor of history at the University of Redlands before coming to the Huntington in 2013. Vanessa has curated 2 library exhibitions, Magna Carta, Law and Legend, and the Reformation from the Word to the World. And she currently serves on the advisory committee for the Contemporary Arts Initiative 5. Vanessa has published on female editorial practices and death rituals, and she is currently writing a book about Alice Spencer, Dowager Countess of Derby, to be published by Atria Books, an imprint of Simon & Schuster. We also have Amanda Burr, who is a book and paper conservator at the Huntington. She earned a Master of Arts and Certificate of Advanced Study in Art Conservation from SUNY Buffalo State College. She also completed a post-baccalaureate certificate program in art conservation at Studio Art Centers International in Florence, Italy. Prior to coming to the Huntington in 2018, Amanda worked as a Mellon Fellow in paper conservation at LACMA and held library conservation internships at UCLA, Layton University, and the University of Iowa. Holly Mendenhall is the digital projects manager at the Huntington Library. She helps plan, coordinate, and implement in-house digitization efforts. So at the end of the presentation, we will leave time for a Q&A, which we will be conducting in the Q&A box, which you'll see at the bottom of your screen. And without further ado, I'll turn it over to Vanessa Wilkie.
Thank you, Jackie. Among the Huntington's 11 million manuscripts and photographs is a subcategory that makes up one of the largest collections of British medieval and Renaissance manuscripts in the Western Hemisphere. The majority of the library's holdings in this area were produced either in England or in Western Europe for an English market. The library holds nearly 500 bound volumes of literary, religious, and historical and legal manuscripts, which contain thousands of separate texts produced between the 11th and 16th centuries. Digitizing individual volumes like these is a big undertaking when you consider the age, fragility, and complexity of these manuscripts. So while the library works to carefully and responsibly digitize individual manuscripts, we've also been developing online tools to help people make their way into these collections. Huntington Library Research Guides are the best way to get an overview and learn about various catalogs, databases, and printed guides that have been produced over the last century. There is an online guide for medieval manuscripts, which also includes some lavishly decorated Renaissance manuscripts, and another guide for British historical manuscripts that pertains more specifically to our archival collections of family papers and documents. Many of our individual bound medieval and decorated Renaissance manuscripts can also be found in our online catalog. And each record gives some basic information about the manuscript it describes. You'll notice links at the top of the catalog records. If the manuscript has been fully digitized and is available on the Huntington's Digital Library, or HDL, that Holly is going to walk us through, there'll be a link to it at the top of the page. The second link will take you to Digital Scriptorium, which is a consortium of museums and libraries around the United States with medieval and Renaissance manuscripts and their holdings. This consortium runs a database which allows people to explore holdings across member institutions on a free single platform. The records here include a lot more information than you typically find in a library catalog, and they frequently contain sample images from the manuscripts. So if a volume hasn't been completely digitized and available on the Huntington's digital library, you'll often find a large array of samples of the manuscript digitized in on-digital Scriptorium. DS was one of the first digital tools of this nature developed in the 1990s, and the Huntington was one of the founding members. But DS is still growing and going. In fact, Digital Scriptorium just received a planning grant from the Institute of Museums and Library Services to begin to redesign this legacy database with a modern digital infrastructure. As our technologies change, we have to continue to find new ways to adapt this data to evolving platforms. Online tools like these research guides, online catalogs, digital libraries, and Digital Scriptorium offer new ways to approach old manuscripts. As exciting as these digital tools are, most of us become curators and conservators and librarians because we love the stuff themselves, the books and documents, the way they feel, the way they smell, the way they sparkle, and the stories they tell us about the lives of people who lived hundreds of years ago. This manuscript is particularly compelling, and it serves as a portal to the Elizabethan past. It is beautiful, complicated, and mysterious. My three favorite things in the manuscript. This is Heroica Eulogia, and the Latin the Latin title doesn't translate particularly cleanly, but it essentially means like blessed book. Henry Huntington acquired the manuscript in 1912 from George Smith, who purchased it for him in 1911 at one of the Robert Hoe sales. Huntington purchased nearly half of the sale of the Hoe library over 2 years, and these sales also brought him his iconic Gutenberg Bible. So this manuscript has long kept some fancy company. It was originally cataloged for the Huntington by Consuelo Dutschke in the 1980s. But the manuscript was completed in 1567, was compiled by William Bowyer, keeper of the Royal Archives in the Tower of London. The book was made for Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester, who was one of Queen Elizabeth's favorites, and a premier courtier and politician of the day. The manuscript is 140 folios written on parchment, meaning that the pages are actually made from the treated skins of animals. We have not yet done DNA testing on the parchment to identify precisely what animal this parchment is made from. Beyond the elaborate heraldic symbols, like this crest for the Earl of Leicester, the manuscript is decorated with 14 large miniatures depicting various historical figures. As this manuscript was made in the midst of the Elizabethan Reformation, there are actually some miniatures that are representing anti-clerical attitudes and some jokes about the clergy. There are Latin verses below each miniature. And these pages replicate the layout of emblem books, which were a popular Renaissance 16th and 17th century genre that blended images and text together. This book also contains extensive copies of land grants, deeds, and eulogies for the Earl's ancestors. Bowyer probably copied documents he found in the Tower archive to make this manuscript. The volume documents and celebrates the ancient feudal authority of the Dudley family. The manuscript is written in 14 different styles of script, and most of the documents are copied in this clean secretary hand, while the verses were done in various italics, probably written by Jean de Bouchon, who in 1570 published the first English handwriting manual. The last folio of the volume contains the most accurate map of the British Isles produced up to that point in time. The map includes several hundred place names marked with little gold dots, where cathedral cities are marked with red. To work through this single manuscript requires expertise in Elizabethan history, politics, patronage, manorial records, heraldry, emblem books, Renaissance Latin verse, art history, manuscript studies, and cartography. This complex manuscript requires collaborative scholarship. A few years ago, Norman Jones, the Elizabethan historian at Utah State, was a distinguished fellow visiting the Huntington. And he and I started talking about how enamored we both were, and yet perplexed by this manuscript. It's always been described as a presentation copy made for the Earl of Leicester, but Norm and I began to suspect that there was a lot more going on there, and we knew we needed to pull together a team of experts to unpack this beautiful, albeit complicated manuscript. With the support of the Huntington's Research Division, we've planned a workshop for scholars and the public to explore this manuscript and collectively work out exactly what Leicester would have wanted with a manuscript like this. Was this just Bowyer's attempt to win the patronage of the Earl of Leicester? Or did Leicester pay Bowyer to compile this manuscript, reflecting his ancient feudal bloodlines and his religious and royal loyalty, so that it serves as the ultimate Renaissance dossier, demonstrating his worthiness to court and potentially marry a queen? Because of COVID-19, this workshop has been rescheduled for October 2021, and I hope that you'll all be able to join us next year for these discussions. The fact that this manuscript supports so many different types of scholarship, its historical significance, and the curiosity that it evokes, made it a prime candidate for digitization. As a curator for this manuscript, I oftentimes start this conversation by considering the needs of scholars, teachers, and the community at large. Once the library decides to pursue digitization, I then hand the books over to my esteemed colleagues in the conservation lab. And Amanda is going to explain what happens there.
Thank you, Vanessa. Okay, I will be giving a brief overview of the conservation treatment of HM160, and I would like to thank my colleague Jessamy Glore, who helped put together this part of the presentation. So, before a book or manuscript is digitized at the Huntington, it is assessed by a conservator who checks its general stability. Photographing an object so that it can be shared online involves a lot of handling, and this can exacerbate certain kinds of damage. When we examine books before photography, we check to see how far the book can be opened without harming its binding, and we also confirm that the ink is well adhered to the page so that it doesn't flake off as the pages are turned and held in place during photography. As Vanessa mentioned, HM160 is made of parchment with text written in iron gall ink, and there are numerous miniatures executed in colored paints. Flaking paint is a common problem with parchment manuscripts because parchment expands and contracts very readily with changes in humidity, and this can dislodge, this movement of the parchment can dislodge the paint. So it wasn't surprising when we found that there were areas of actively flaking paint in HM160. In response to this, the decision was made to treat the manuscript prior to photography. The idea was to re-adhere any loose pigment to the parchment pages using a thinned adhesive that conservators refer to as a consolidant. The first step in planning treatment was to conduct a methodical assessment of the manuscript's illustrated pages. This was done with two goals in mind. First was to measure the magnitude of the problem and to estimate how many hours it would take to treat the manuscript. The second goal was to identify the specific types of damage present so that treatment could be tailored to address the specific needs of the manuscript. Oh, sorry. This project was very labor intensive, and it was done collaboratively with work shared among 4 conservators from the Huntington's Preservation Lab, and Christy Westberg, Senior Book and Paper Conservator, was the lead conservator on this project. During the preliminary assessment, 23 of the manuscript's 39 paintings, which included coats of arms, were spot checked under a microscope. Of those 23, 9 were found to have flaking paint. Once we understood that this was a problem not just on 1 or 2 pages, but throughout the manuscript, Christie calculated the estimated number of hours that would be needed to test and treat every painted surface. She measured the average size of each type of painting in square centimeters, and she counted the number of each present in the manuscript. She then used a formula established by conservators at Harvard to calculate the total number of hours. In the case of HM160, a generous estimate indicated that 250 hours of treatment time might be needed. During the condition assessment, we observed that the paint was failing in two distinct ways. Each type of failure had different underlying causes and would need to be addressed with different treatment methods. In some areas, paint was flaking away from the parchment. Flaking paint would need to be treated by feeding a consolidant under the lifting flakes to reattach them to the parchment below. Those of you who watched my colleague Christina O'Connell treat Blue Boy will be familiar with this treatment technique. In other areas, the paint was friable, which really means that it was powdery. This media appeared dry and granular and was falling off of the parchment as a powder. In areas of friable media, you can't use a brush to apply a consolidant because a wet brush will dislodge and lift away the powdery pigments. So for these areas, we would need to apply the consolidant as a fine mist that could be absorbed into the paint and help it to readhere both to the parchment and to itself. We also noticed that several of the problem areas had suspected metallic components that presented their own challenges. These included friable greens that were likely copper-based pigments and silver leaf. As you know, many metals will corrode if exposed to moisture. Copper-based green pigments are particularly prone to corrosion, and silver tarnishes easily in the presence of humidity. Our most common consolidants are proteinaceous adhesives derived from animals like gelatin from cows and isinglass from fish, and these need to be dissolved in water. So for areas with metallic components, we would need to find an adhesive that could be dissolved in something other than water so that we wouldn't risk causing corrosion. Oops. All of our work, both testing and treatment, was done with the aid of a stereo microscope. On the right side is an image of Christie testing the media. The manuscript was carefully strapped open on a board cradle to allow safe access during our work. The stability of the paint was tested using a paper point. Paper points, which are a tool borrowed from the field of dentistry, are thin needles made of rolled paper. To test the media, the conservator used a paper point to gently tap the surface of the painted areas. This was done meticulously, checking 1 square centimeter at a time. If any movement of the pigment was observed, a consolidant was applied to the area. Conservators worked in 2-hour shifts, testing the paint, then carefully treating unstable areas using the consolidant and delivery method appropriate to that area. Flaking paint was readhered with gelatin dissolved in warm deionized water applied by brush. Friable paint was treated with a consolidant applied as a fine mist. In most areas, the consolidant was again a solution of gelatin in water. For areas with metallic components, Klucel G dissolved in ethanol was used instead. Klucel G is a cellulose ether that can be dissolved in alcohol, so it was appropriate for this treatment. Once a section of a painting had been consolidated, and after a day to allow for thorough drying, a different conservator would retest that same area to confirm that the consolidation had been a success. If any paint was still loose, additional consolidant was applied, and this work was subsequently checked by a different conservator, and so on until all flaking and friable paint had been successfully stabilized. Communication was extremely important during this process, and in addition to talking with each other about our work, we kept a record of progress by annotating printed photographs of the pages of the manuscript on which we were working. Here are 2 examples of our treatment records. They give an impression of the complexity of the project and of conservation work in general. Reading the annotations, you can see that a single page often took a week or longer to treat, and that even tiny areas demanded the repeated attention of multiple hands. And just to clarify, these are photographs of the manuscript that were printed on copier paper and kept in a 3-ring binder. And this is what we annotated. We would never put post-its or write notes on the manuscript itself. So all told, the treatment of this manuscript took 100 hours. And that is less time than the 250 hours estimated, but it was still a major time commitment. Conservation work is a crucial part of the digitization process, and the Huntington Preservation Department works hard with our colleagues to make our collections accessible. I hope that this overview has illuminated some of the challenges and considerations involved in preparing materials for digitization. Even seemingly straightforward issues can demand significant expertise, careful planning, specialized equipment, and time. And with that, I will turn things over to Holly Mendenhall.
Thank you, Amanda. It's such a treat to peek behind the curtain and see all of the hard work that goes into preserving our very special collections here at the Huntington. Let me share my screen real fast. Great. As mentioned, my name is Holly Mendenhall, and I've served as the library's digital projects manager since November. For the next portion of this talk, I hope to shed some light on how the library digitizes collection material and also share some of the features of our digital library that will hopefully inspire you to explore further, but from the safety of your home. Holding more than 11 million items that span from the 11th century to present, the Huntington Library is a literal treasure trove. While the extent and variety of these materials make the library a wonderful place to undertake research, the sheer breadth of our collections means digitizing in toto is going to be an impossible endeavor. That doesn't mean we haven't tried, though. Over the past decade, staff across the library have worked collaboratively to bring a selection of Huntington materials online via the Huntington Digital Library, or HDL. The HDL presently hosts well over 300,000 images covering diverse subject matter, varying from medieval illuminated manuscripts, and this is a different one than the one we're describing today, to Maynard Parker's luminescent photographs of post-war suburbia, from printed books to holographic letters, such as this note Susan B. Anthony excitedly penned to Elizabeth Cady Stanton upon successfully voting in an 1872 election. To the extensive holdings of the J.T. Last collection of graphic arts and social history, which documents consumer culture, Wizard Oil, social history, and American lithography. The Huntington has a long history of using photo duplication as a tool capable of deepening research and expanding the reach of our holdings. The strong foundation for our stellar in-house imaging department was set by one of the Huntington's earliest employees, Lodwick Bendixson. Following Henry Huntington from New York to San Marino, Dr. Bendixson served as the head of the Department of Photographic Reproduction from 1928 until his retirement in 1943. Interested in the photographic technology of the time, he pioneered techniques in document copying and forensic photography. Dr. Bendixson is shown here with Benjamin Franklin's ink-stained autobiography, the text of which he was able to make legible using filtered visible light. You can view both this image itself and Franklin's autobiography on the HDL. Many decades have passed, but the Huntington remains dedicated to facilitating discovery and scholarship, particularly among our most unique collections. Requested frequently by readers at the library, HM 160 was a prime candidate for reformatting, both to reduce wear on it and increase access to this irreplaceable book. As Vanessa described, when an item or collection is prioritized for digitization, accomplishing as much requires support from many departments across the library. A curator determines what material will be imaged. Retrieval staff brings those materials to preservation for a complete assessment of stability and readiness for handling. Pending completion of any treatments, the item then travels to our acquisitions, cataloging, and metadata services department, where a cataloger will generate the enhanced metadata seen on the HDL. Only once the series of checks has been completed will our wonderful imaging staff photograph the material in their lab. one bay of which is seen here. This is our new V cradle that allows us to photograph books without opening them too far. As you can see, digitization is a cost, labor, and time-intensive venture, but one that offers many rewards, many of which we're reaping now in these isolating times. While looking at images of treasures from your couch in your PJs may be benefit enough, there are many exciting advances in the digital collections access that transform how research and analysis are undertaken. One of the most promising developments is an open framework known as IIIF, short for the International Image Interoperability Framework. IIIF is a global community primarily composed of cultural heritage organizations that share the goal of enabling flexible, persistent access to image-based resources. The community has established a framework of standards that rely on interoperable technology, allowing archives, libraries, and museums to readily share their materials via the same platform. If an online image is IIIF compliant, it can be manifested into a source-agnostic workspace. An image can be stored and hosted by one repository and invoked in a completely different workspace. Hundreds of institutions are producing IIIF compliant material, including the Huntington Library. This map shows the wide proliferation of participating institutions. With just a few clicks, we can easily bring together content from across the world. IIIF is of particular interest to the manuscript community because it offers the possibility of an enhanced examination, comparison, and annotation without the burden of travel or restricted access. This technology is best seen in action rather than described, though. So using the Heroica, I'd like to now demonstrate some of the features of our digital library. So bear with me while I switch to a live demo. Okay. You should be seeing my browser now. I'm going to bring up the HDL, which is hdl.huntington.org, and I'm going to navigate to the manuscripts category, where there is a direct link to HM160. I'm going to click that. And looking at the item page, you can find the usual embedded page navigation. Cataloging information is down below. We have the object description, and each page has its own additional metadata. I can explore the binding. I can flip from page to page. I can download an image for my later use, save it to my hard drive. Clicking on this expansion icon allows me to pan and zoom in and out, functionality we've grown accustomed to whilst online shopping. But the functionality I most want to show you is accessed via this easily missed icon, stylized 3 columns into an M. Clicking the M should bring up a new workspace, the Mirador Viewer. Mirador is an open source IIIF associated image viewing platform that has a few advanced features that are useful for manuscript examination. As is readily apparent, I can easily see all the pages of the book in this scroll bar down here, and the view settings can be changed. If I don't want to just see one page at a time, I can do a 2-up book view. I can create a large scroll, or I find this most handy is I can look at a thumbnail of all of, I look at each page in the thumbnail gallery view. So I'm going to pull up one of my favorite miniatures, a woman boxing a lecherous monk's ear with a slipper. It's just a funny satirical little picture. So once everything loads, I'm going to select that item. I'm going to change the view to just a single image. And I'm going to click these three little dots to make the scroll wheel go away, and this hamburger to make the side table go away. And I can look far more closely at this beautiful manuscript, and we can really zoom in on her hitting him with a shoe. I can look at the brush strokes. I can examine the penmanship quite closely. You can even see the pores of the parchment from whatever animal to be determined this paper was made from. So suppose I was more interested in just the verse rather than this beautiful painting. I'm reading along and I know that the verse goes on to the next page. It's kind of frustrating to have to flip back and forth. So I'm going to demonstrate one of Mirador's best features, in my opinion. I can add a window to the workspace. So clicking on the very far left is these windows icon. I'm going to add a slot, and it's prompting me to add an item. So I'm going to click there. And it already has this book loaded because it's what I'm looking at already. So I'm going to add that in, and I'm going to find the next page, which does take a little bit of time, but you'll get used to it real fast. And now I can read this whole verse at once, which is very handy. Now I don't have to flip back and forth, and it's just one of the best features. And there are many uses for it, as I'm sure you can imagine. Let's say I wanted to look at multiple crests at once. I'm going to change the layout, and I'm going to select the number of windows I want to see. So there are 24 crests, I think, in this manuscript, but let's just pull up 4. And I can pull up the gallery view and just find, let's see, here's one crest. I'm going to do the same thing, find another crest. And I think you're probably getting the picture, but let's complete the exercise. And so you can get a sense of where similar shapes were used, the variation in depiction. We can compare these animals, for example. It's the same feature that I can use to invoke IIIF compliant images from other institutions. We know that most of the calligraphic scripts in HM160 correspond to those in the first printed handwriting manual to appear in English, a book containing diverse sorts of hands. The Huntington, surprisingly, does not have a copy of this manual, but the Folger Shakespeare Library does, and it's made a few pages available online. And I've already pulled that up, so we're going to navigate to there. You'll notice that their digital collection appears very different from the Huntington's, and you might not think that they could work together. But we can take advantage of IIIF interoperability by copying the manifest URL from the source repository or dragging a IIIF logo into the workspace. You can generally find a manifest link in any given collection by looking at the cataloging metadata, but the Folger actually puts their manifests under the share, and I see IIIF, and I'm going to copy this URL, and I'm going to go back to my Mirador, and I'm going to change the layout, so we're just looking at 2 things, and I'm going to replace the object, and I'm going to paste in this URL that I've got and load it. And sure enough, a book containing diverse sorts of hands is showing up. And I can, let's see, let's pull up some script to compare. This is not. As Vanessa mentioned, there are 14 different types of hands in this book. Let me find one that matches. 136, I believe. So we're looking at this italic hand, and we can zoom on in, and let's compare this Q. They look pretty similar. So, you know, this is such an interesting case of a printed book teaching handwriting and an actual handwriting that predates it, but is probably the same author. So the map of the British Isles that Vanessa pointed out would also be a good contender for comparison with other medieval maps of the region. Similar to what we just did, we can navigate and find a map from around the same time, in this case 1595. I'm going to go back to my Mirador. I'm going to pull up the map, which is on folio 141. Got the map. And now I'm going to replace this object. Actually, I'm going to add a slot. And I'm going to show you how you can just drag in when you see a IIIF logo, this is at Stanford, you can just grab it and bring it into, too many tabs open, into your workspace, and it should change and say drop to load manifest. So I'm going to do that, and here it is. Let's close this window and we can zoom right in. 1567 versus, well, if I click this information icon, I get the metadata provided by the institution that's hosting it. And so what's there varies. But if you ever open too many tabs, too many windows, this is a good way to figure out what it is you're looking at. So 1595 versus 1567, and you can see one certainly may have informed the other. We can continue this exercise and keep adding maps in. This is from the University of Edinburgh, and it's a map of Scotland. So I'm going to click share again, copy link, add it in. And one feature I haven't shown you of Mirador is that it has built-in image manipulation that does not impact the image permanently. So I can tell that I'm going to need to rotate this to make a comparison. So I have rotating features. I can change the brightness. I saw a question earlier about the bleed through, and these image manipulation features are a good way to adjust the contrast if the bleed through bothers you. You can also just reset the image to go back to where you started. But here we go. We can pull up Scotland and just continue doing comparisons like this. If you find an image from an institution that is not IIIF compliant, unfortunately at this time you cannot invoke that image in the Mirador Viewer, but I do know that they are trying to work on that. We don't have time here to cover many of the innovations being driven by the manuscript community. There's some really neat stuff going on, annotation, text overlay, line detection, handwriting recognition, but I hope you can still see the potential of this technology, allowing scholars to examine copy-specific features of individual books and draw on evidence from across the world to make new connections and discoveries. Whether interested in intellectual content, materiality, or provenance, the flexibility provided by IIIF makes this historically tedious work a little easier. We could all use a little bit easier these days. Making materials available for research and use outside the reading room, especially now, is part and parcel of the Huntington Library's mission to share our collections and engage with a global community. So without further ado, I am going to pull up a little Q&A and we can answer some of these questions that I see rolling in.
Thanks, Holly, and thanks, Vanessa and Amanda, for that amazing presentation. So we'll move into the Q&A portion. We got a lot of great questions, so we'll just start going through them quickly as we're discussing questions that have come up. There is a contact here for the library, so if you think of questions after the fact that we didn't get to today, feel free to email us. We're actively answering emails every day at the Huntington during the week, and we have a link here to a related research guide that will be helpful for you. So we'll dive into the questions here. Let me see here. So let's see here. So we have a question that is, I would love to hear your thoughts, especially Vanessa's thoughts, on how collaborative research on manuscripts, especially those requiring multiple areas of expertise, can be accomplished in our current digital context. Do we know yet what this looks like? What if the manuscript hasn't been digitized, for instance?
Well, there are a lot of variables, of course, and we know what it looks like kind of depending on the manuscript, depending on the participants, but it's a changing landscape. The way we're thinking about collaboration in August is quite different than the conversations we were having around scholarly collaboration just in April, and I suspect that that landscape is going to continue to evolve. So while we're hopeful that in October 2021, for example, we can all come together to work on this manuscript in person, that might not actually be the case. I think that there are a lot of ways to approach this, but one of the things I would recommend is to, it really matters who you're working with. You want to build a team of people that have the capacity to think about these things right now, and that changes on a day-to-day basis. So starting with people that, share an interest in the subject, starting with someone whose work overlaps a bit with yours and intersects with yours is a way to start a conversation. I think if you take a look at Twitter and Twitterstorian, for example, you will find a community of scholars who are turning to digital platforms, just yearning for connections and collaborations and brainstorming. And social media is one way to do that. IIIF, of course, as Holly's just demonstrated, is another fantastic way of doing that. The danger, I think, is that we become really codependent on images and on digital surrogates and think that our work has to come to a screeching halt if a manuscript hasn't been digitized. But of course, scholars around the world have transcriptions of materials. There are critical editions that have been published. We have research notes that we can share. So while that doesn't ever really take the place of being in a room and looking at something together, there is still a lot of data, both manuscript, hard written, and metadata that can facilitate discussions. But I think the most important thing is to start by asking questions and looking for people who are asking similar and intersecting questions.
Okay, I'll read another question here. During conservation prior to digitization, were there areas where paint or pigment has been lost? If so, were those areas left empty or were attempts made to replace lost color?
Sure. So there were areas of loss that had already occurred, and there was no attempt made to fill those losses. Really, the emphasis was just to preserve the original material that was already there. And in general, that is the general approach, especially for library objects. For things like paintings and prints, there may be more of a reason to prioritize the aesthetics, and so there might be an argument to fill a visual loss, but especially with library materials, it's really more about that object and its history, how it was made, what it's been through, and so we really were trying to preserve that.
Excellent. I'll dive into another question here since we have so many. Somebody's asking about topic indexing on images in our digital libraries. So for example, if someone was interested in images of musical instruments, would there be any way to search an individual manuscript or group of manuscripts for that topic?
That is a good question. It requires a lot of work from the metadata group, and certainly there are capabilities, but given how many items we have, we simply can't enrich every item to its fullest potential, and it can be a bit contentious about how you tag something or subject catalog it. And so for many of our items in the HDL, we do have transcriptions, and when you search, it will search those transcriptions. But for this manuscript, for example, we do not have transcriptions. One nice feature of Mirador and HDL that I didn't show is that we can actually, our platform Content DM, you can save favorites and you can sort of create your own little catalog of materials that you're interested in. But certainly some other institutions have really put a lot of effort into creating searchable, trying to find everything that's possible to search, but we haven't gotten there yet.
I would do a plug here for Digital Scriptorium as well, because online platforms and databases like that pull from lots of institutions. You can do some subject searching for music, for example, or if there's a particular genre of miniature that you know frequently depict musical instruments as part of that iconography, you can search for those images. But you also, as Holly pointed out, you are inheriting different institutions, standard, not so standard application of subject headings within a union catalog like Digital Scriptorium. So it is a place to begin, but it's nothing will ever take the place of turning the pages and looking at the objects themselves, because only you will know necessarily what you know and bring your eye to the image itself. But union catalogs like Digital Scriptorium is a really great place to get started.
And we have a lot of questions about AAAF resources, how to get started, which libraries are participating. So I did drop a link to a companion research guide in the chat box, as well as a feedback form. So please complete that as well if you're able to and you have time. We would love to hear your feedback on this talk. But also check out that research guide for how to get started with AAAF. And we will also follow up with all of these questions after the fact via email if you don't get to it today. I'm going to dive into another question here. With the closure of the library due to COVID-19, are the conservation and digitization labs also at a standstill? If so, what are you working on and how?
I'll take that one. For the safety of our staff, since there were so many unknowns with COVID for a long time, no one was on campus and work was at a standstill. But just this week, we have restarted operations in a really limited capacity, just with preservation and imaging staff. And what we were working on in between is, I think, is probably true for everyone out there. There's a backlog of cleaning up and suspended tasks that you always seem to put off. So my colleague Mario Einaudi and I have been working on cleaning up the HDL, making the search features a little bit better. He's done a lot of heavy lifting on that. And I know in conservation, Amanda, maybe you could speak better to it, but that there has been some work on campus and making sure that all of our items are safe, and also keeping up on your skills and maintaining all of the scientific knowledge you have.
Yeah, I'll just add a little bit. But yeah, you basically covered it. But yes, we have a backlog of things that we've been working on. We've been updating some of our lab policies. We also have started, we've purchased, and then we've been working on a ticketing system for requesting conservation treatment of objects. So it'll be much more organized and straightforward. So we've just, we are preparing to make the lab run more smoothly once we get back in full capacity.
Okay, great. So I'm going to just dive into some more questions here. Let's see, I'm reading through all of these. You discussed the ways to affix loose pigments, but didn't discuss the actual digitization process. Is there a specialized scanner you use to capture such scalable images?
So it depends on the material, but I showed you a picture of our V cradle, which is essentially a copy stand with a cradle to cradle the material, and it actually has a very light vacuum to keep the page affixed and flat. And so most of our photography is overhead copy stand photography, and all of the photographers have been trained in handling and work with preservation in maintaining all of the work that they've done and keeping our objects safe. I see a lot of questions about sort of resolution and sizes of the image. The images that are available on the HDL are 300 PSI. And let's see what else. I don't want to jump ahead in the queue for you, Jackie, but I can answer that this took a week to digitize. It was digitized last October, and it really just sort of depends on the uniformity of the object. If there are different size pages or little insets, or if it's very tightly bound, if it requires intervention from preservation at the time of imaging, so preservation will come and help hold open objects appropriately. Those are all factors that can impact the time it takes. But in this case, it took just a week, which is incredible.
I'm going to read one more question here. So people are asking about how libraries can make this process of working on conservation with library materials more transparent for researchers. They're wondering if there are other conservation efforts that have been done on manuscripts that are already cataloged, for instance. They're excited to learn more, so if you guys could just weigh in on the typical amount of conservation work, I suppose with General Huntington collections, items that are cataloged.
I can just jump in and then hand it over to Amanda. We do oftentimes, curators and conservators work really closely with collection material. Sometimes when it's brand new and maybe the item isn't brand new, but it's a new acquisition that has just come into the library. We frequently meet, I meet with my colleagues in conservation a lot just to help me assess what I'm looking at, the stability of what I'm looking at. The voice of the conservators is really important when considering acquisitions, because we want to be careful that we're not taking in something that might be dangerously unstable, or we might not be good stewards for it. But then beyond that, oftentimes, we'll find things in the stacks that need treatment, and depending on what the queue is and what the workload is, we will work with conservators to ask, is this something that you can take on right now, as you're also weighing that against the exhibition prep that you're doing and the other treatments that you're already committed to? And then we oftentimes rely on our readers in the reading room who are working with materials and might find something. We have outstandingly responsible readers who contact curators through reader services regularly to say, I've been looking at this book and I'm a little concerned about the binding, or I found this leaf and it's a little loose. And then the curator will either take it up to conservation, or if it's something where a conservator's expert eye can help the researcher gain some understanding about what they're looking at, we oftentimes will try and make appointments for researchers to visit the lab and for people to safely, use raking light or use backlight to understand if there's an overpaint on some illuminated manuscript. So, conservators do play a really important role in the daily operations of the library. And usually it's because people have asked either a curator or, someone in reader services in Jackie's department to initiate that conversation.
And I can also say quickly that this webinar is an effort to make that process more transparent, and the preservation team actually pitched this idea, which is great. And I think that with COVID, you know, it's giving us these new opportunities to develop these instructional programs online, which actually lends itself well to talking about items that require, you know, close imaging to understand the conservation process. A virtual platform like Zoom is perfect for that. So even though these are trying times, it's kind of opened a door for libraries to have some different sort of analysis of their library materials and instruction around that.
Yeah, I'll just add quickly, conservators, you know, we keep very careful records of all the work we do, photographic and written. So those records are there, and also conservators love to share and collaborate. That's part of our work that we really value. And in the past, preservation has been kind of siloed off, you know, done behind the scenes, and really conservators want to be transparent and want to provide the information. So that's something we've definitely been talking about, and as Jackie mentioned, this is an effort in that direction. So we really value our relationships with curators, with readers, and we are moving in the direction of, you know, sharing what we have access to and collaborating. So.
Yeah.
I see a question about dimensions that I can answer really quickly that I wasn't clear about. So for HM160 on the long dimension, it's 11,000 pixels. And these are very large files shot at 600 DPI. I don't know why I said PSI before, thinking about tires. But so they're very big. They're meant to be archival files, and we shoot in RAW and then turn it into derivative files. So we do have archival copies that are not a part of this digital library.
And someone is also asking, will you be giving presentations specifically on manuscripts like this one throughout the year? And I definitely think we are going to be talking more about manuscripts and other collection materials and just issues and cool topics related to our work at the library. And we hope to host those on webinars and also who knows what else down the road. So please stay tuned. You can check the Huntington website for updates on upcoming programs. I also included a link to our research guide. There was an issue with the first link. I put a new link in the chat box. So that page with the research guides is also a great place to check in terms of instructional guides on highlighting collection materials. So feel free to explore there. And I suppose it's 1 minute to 11, so we'll be wrapping up here. Please do fill out the feedback form too. We'd really appreciate your comments on this talk. And I really am so glad that we could all gather in this virtual space today and see you all virtually. With that, I think we'll end the webinar. And thank you so much for attending, and take care, everyone, and great to see you today.
Thank you all.
Thank you,
everyone.